Today we are starting a brand new story. What if female Deku had a sinister quirk and everyone became obsessed with her? Let's go. The day Izuku Midoriya's quirk manifested was the single worst day of her life, and she had a lot of competition for that title. It was her 14th birthday. She was sitting in the consultation room of a quirk counselor because her mother had finally, after 10 years of telling herself Izuku was a late bloomer, accepted that her daughter was either genuinely quirkless or carrying something that the standard diagnostics could not detect. The counselor was a kind woman with round glasses and a very practiced voice, the voice of someone who had delivered this kind of news many times and had developed a whole system of compassion around it. She was 3 sentences into her prepared speech when Izuku felt it. Not pain, not heat, not the crackling energy that most quirk manifestations came with, something quieter and deeper and considerably more wrong. It was like a door opening in her chest that she had not known was there. And through that door came something she could only describe, later in Notebook 23, as warmth with teeth. The counselor stopped mid-sentence. She looked at Izuku. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, not in the way a person's face changes when something shocking happens, in the way a face changes when something underneath it shifts, when the thoughts that had been running through someone's mind quietly reroute to a single new destination. She said slowly, "Midoriya-san." Izuku looked at her. The counselor said, "I was going to tell you something important. I can't quite remember what it was." A pause. "Can I help you?" the counselor said, in a tone that had not been in her voice 4 seconds ago. "Is there anything you need, anything at all?" Izuku stared. She could feel it now, the door in her chest, open, radiating something outward. She could feel it hitting the counselor the way sound hits a wall, and she could feel the counselor's attention snapping toward her like iron filings toward a magnet. She said very carefully, "I think my quirk just manifested." The counselor looked at her with an expression that Izuku had no previous vocabulary for, and was now going to have to develop new vocabulary to describe. Devotion, complete, immediate, unearned devotion. The specific quality of a person who has just decided that the most important thing in the world is the well-being of the person across from them. The counselor said, "I will do anything to help you." Izuku looked at her. She looked at her hands. She thought about every class she had ever taken, every hero she had ever studied, every notebook she had ever filled with the specific and embarrassing earnestness of a girl who had spent 10 years trying to earn a world that had decided she did not qualify. She thought about the word sinister. She closed the door. Or tried to. She had not had it long enough to know how to close it entirely. But she narrowed it, the way you narrow a gate rather than closing it, and the counselor blinked. The counselor said. She blinked again. "I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. Where were we?" "You were going to tell me I'm quirkless," Izuku said. The counselor looked at her chart. She looked at Izuku. She said, in the careful voice of someone whose professional framework has just encountered data it does not have a category for, "I don't think that's accurate anymore." Izuku looked at her notebook. She opened it. She wrote at the top of the next clean page, Notebook 23, Quirk Assessment. Below that, name unknown, classification unknown, mechanism unknown. Below that, because she was always honest with herself, even when she preferred not to be. Danger level significant. First documented effect, complete voluntary devotion in a previously indifferent adult. Duration, approximately 40 seconds with minimal output. Intensity proportional to proximity. Vector, unknown. Trigger, emotional state, possible. Passive active, currently passive. She looked at what she had written. She thought about heroes who used their quirks on people without consent. She thought about that for a long time. She closed the notebook. She said, "I need to think about some things." The counselor looked at her with an expression that was back to normal now, but with a residual quality in it that Izuku recognized as the afterimage of what the quirk did. A lingering warmth, an inclination, not devotion anymore, but the memory of it, like the impression a very bright light leaves when you close your eyes. She said, "Of course, take all the time you need." Izuku stood up. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the office. She stood on the street outside and looked at the city and thought about what had just happened to her. She thought, "I have a quirk." She thought, "It makes people devoted to me against their will." She thought, "I am never telling anyone what this quirk does." She started walking home. 3 blocks later, she passed a businessman who was looking down at his phone. He glanced up as she passed. Their eyes met for approximately half a second. The door in her chest was not fully closed. The man took 2 steps after her. He stopped himself, looked confused, looked at his phone, looked back at her. She walked faster. Behind her, the businessman stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, not quite understanding why he suddenly felt like he had missed something important. She turned the corner. She ran. Chapter 2: What she named it. It took her 4 days to name it. This was longer than it usually took her to name things. She had named her previous 47 notebooks, her color-coded analysis system, the 3-tier observation hierarchy she had developed to structure her hero research, all within 24 hours of creating them. She was fast with names. Names helped her understand things. Once something had a name, it was real and manageable and could be put in the correct category. This quirk was taking longer because she kept landing on the wrong name and having to discard it. She tried charisma, discarded, too mild, too close to something natural and earned. She tried devotion field, discarded, too passive, too much like it was something that just happened rather than something she was doing. She tried gravity, the metaphorical kind, not Urarakas, discarded, too flattering. On the 4th day, she wrote in notebook 23, pull. She looked at it. She thought about the mechanism, the way the quirk reached out from her and touched the attention of people nearby and redirected it toward her. The way it was not mind control, exactly, because the people it affected retained their personalities and their memories and their ability to function. They simply prioritized her, above whatever else they had been doing, above whatever they had been feeling. They looked at her and felt, with some intensity proportional to the dose they received, that her well-being was the most important thing in their immediate world. Pull, she wrote, like gravity, like tides, not a force that overcame you, a force that changed your direction before you noticed you were moving. Below that, she wrote the rules. She was very good at rules. She had needed them before for other things. She had rules for her notebooks, rules for her training, rules for the way she spoke to Kakin in public versus the way she thought about him in private, rules for the specific management of being a person with no quirk in a world that had decided that meant she was not a person. The rules for Pull were different. They were not about her maintaining a system. They were about other people maintaining their autonomy. Rule 1: do not use the quirk deliberately, ever, not to gain advantage, not in training, not in combat, not in social situations. Rule 2: keep it suppressed AT baseline when around people. Baseline is the minimum output possible. Figure out what minimum output possible is. Rule 3: if someone shows signs of being affected, the specific quality of attention, the warmth in the face, the subtle reorientation of their focus, increase distance immediately. Rule 4: do not tell anyone. Rule 4 addendum: do not tell anyone, especially the people you actually want to like you. She looked at that last one for a long time. Then she wrote because it was true and she was always honest with herself. Rule 5: remember that anything anyone feels around you might not be real. Do not count it, do not enjoy it. It belongs to the quirk, not to you. This was the rule that was hardest to write. She closed notebook 23. She opened notebook 24. She went back to studying heroes. Chapter 3: the first day she went outside. She managed to keep the quirk suppressed for 11 days. This was harder than it sounds. 11 days of operating at the minimum possible output, which she had determined, through careful experimentation in progressively populated spaces, was a level of emission barely above 0 that still allowed the quirk to feel stable. Like the difference between turning off an engine and letting it idle. She could idle. She could not apparently turn it fully off. She had not tried to use it once. This was also harder than it sounds, and she was honestly proud of herself. She went to school. She sat in class. She paid attention to everything, the way she always had, from the back corner where she had spent 3 years being invisible, and she paid particular attention to whether anyone was paying attention to her. Day 1, 2 people looked at her. One looked away immediately, one looked back twice. Day 2, she wore her hair differently, no measurable difference in the data. Day 3, she sat in a different seat. 3 people looked at her. 2 of the 3 were sitting directly adjacent, and she noted that proximity was confirmed as a factor. Day 4, Kakin said something to her in the hallway that she did not register, because she was concentrating so hard on maintaining baseline suppression in a high-density hallway at lunchtime that her focus was entirely internal. He said it again. She looked at him. The quirk pulsed. Not because she meant it to, because she had been suppressing it hard for 4 days, and she was tired, and the moment she looked directly at someone and felt the specific anxious spike of encountering Kaken in a mood, the quirk read the emotional input as a reason to activate. Kaken stopped mid-sentence. He looked at her. His expression did the thing she had learned to recognize in the 4 days since it had happened to the counselor, the specific quiet shift of someone whose attention has just changed its entire orientation. He said in a voice that was not his normal voice, "Are you okay?" She stared at him. Kaken had never once in his life asked if she was okay. She said, "What?" He said, "You look tired." There was something in his face that she had never seen in 11 years of knowing him. It was not soft exactly. Kaken did not do soft, but it was attentive in a way that had a completely different quality than his usual attention, which was either ignoring her or weaponizing her. This attention was directed at her. For her, she took 3 large steps backward. She suppressed the pulse hard. The effort of it made her slightly dizzy. Kaken blinked. He looked around. He looked back at her with his normal expression, aggressive, assessing, the default face of someone who was perpetually ready to be offended. He said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Going to class." She turned around. She walked very fast. In notebook 23 later she wrote, KACCHAN incident, proximity, approximately 0.8 meters, duration of effect, estimated 4 seconds, residual effect, unknown. Note, the pulse was triggered by an emotional spike. Emotional state is a trigger. This is a problem. Below that, do not have emotions, NEARKACCHAN. She looked at that. She added, impossible, find another solution. Chapter 4, What the Quirk Did at the UA entrance exam. She had debated not applying. She had debated it for 3 weeks, across 7 pages of notebook 23, and a full separate notebook she started specifically for the decision, notebook 25, titled, CONSIDEITIONSRE, UA. The arguments against, her quirk was not combat applicable without being used deliberately on opponents, which she had a rule against. The exam required direct physical engagement. Proximity management in an exam environment with 800 students was a logistical nightmare. There was a non-zero probability that under exam stress, the quirk would activate involuntarily, which would affect other examinees, which would be wrong. The arguments for 10 years of notebooks, 10 years of analysis, 10 years of studying heroes and their quirks and their methods, and the systems they operated in, and the gaps in those systems where people got hurt. 10 years of genuinely, completely, humiliatingly wanting to be a hero. She applied. She walked into the exam center. She turned the suppression up as high as it would go. She assessed the course. She ran. The first 20 minutes were fine. She operated at the far edge of every group, clearing robots with the physical training she had spent years building, 3 years of conditioning, specifically designed for a body that did not have a quirk to compensate for. She kept her distance. She kept the quirk locked down. She worked efficiently and without drama. Then the 0-pointer appeared. And a girl ahead of her, short hair, round face, the specific expression of someone about to make a decision they were going to regret for approximately 2 seconds, before it became a decision they were proud of, ran directly toward it. Izumi stopped. She assessed. The 0-pointer was a points trap and a threat management test. You were not supposed to engage it. Everyone knew this. The girl ahead of her clearly knew this, because she had the expression of someone who knew, and had decided it didn't matter, because there was a boy pinned under rubble directly in the 0-pointer's path, and she was not going to leave him there. Izumi made a calculation. The girl's quirk, she had observed it briefly earlier, something involving zero gravity, objects levitated when touched, was not going to be sufficient for the 0-pointer. She was not supposed to use pull deliberately. This was exactly the scenario she had written Rule 1 for. She watched the girl run toward the 0-pointer. She thought about Rule 1. She thought about the boy under the rubble. She thought about 10 years of hero analysis, 47 notebooks, and the specific, complete, sincere, embarrassing certainty that a hero was someone who moved first and dealt with the complications after. She ran. She was not going to use pull on the 0-pointer because a machine could not feel it. Pull worked on conscious minds. What she was going to do was use her legs, which were in excellent condition, and her training, which had been extensive, and her analysis of the 0-pointer's movement pattern, which she had been building since she entered the course. She reached the girl Uraraka. She would find out later, Uraraka or Chako. At the same moment, the zero-pointer's arm came down. She grabbed Uraraka's arm. She pulled her sideways. The arm hit the ground where Uraraka had been standing. And then something happened that Izumi had not planned for and would spend considerable time analyzing afterward. The proximity was very close. Uraraka's arm in her hand, the emotional intensity of the moment, very high. The suppression she had been maintaining for 20 minutes of physical exertion, strained. The quirk pulsed. Not full, not the open-door version. A small, involuntary, adrenaline-driven burst, the kind of emission she associated with emotional spikes she had not managed to prevent. Uraraka looked at her. The zero-pointer was still moving. Uraraka said, "Together." There was something in her face that was warmer than the situation strictly called for. Something that Izumi recognized. Something that sent a complicated wave through her chest that had nothing to do with the quirk, and everything to do with the fact that this was the first person who had looked at her like that, and it still might not be real. She said, "Together." They took down the zero-pointer together, Uraraka's zero-gravity lifting the debris so the trapped boy could escape, Izumi working the structural weak points she had identified with the physical training that had never needed a quirk to be effective. The zero-pointer fell. The exam ended. In the aftermath, Uraraka was looking at her with those eyes that Izumi had not decided how to feel about. She said, "I don't think I've ever seen someone move like that without a quirk. What's your quirk?" Izumi looked at her. She thought about Rule 4. She said, "It's complicated." Uraraka looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She said, "I want to know everything." Izumi did not let herself count that. She put it in the category labeled, "Not real, possibly quirk INDUCD, do not engage." She said, "Maybe later." She walked away. In Notebook 23 that night she wrote, UIIKAOCHAKO zero gravity quirk, round face, said I want to know everything. Duration of exposure, approximately 8 SECONDSAT close range under high emotional intensity. Possible quirk effect, unconfirmed. Do not treat as genuine until confirmed. She stopped. She looked at what she had written. She added, because she was always honest with herself even when she preferred not to be, she seemed genuine before the pulse. This is the complicating factor. I need more data. She closed the notebook. She thought about UA. She thought about Class 1A, which she had presumably made it into, with hundreds of people in close proximity for 3 years, and her quirk running on idle, and Rule 1 and Rule 5. She thought, this is going to be very complicated. Chapter 5, AIZAWA and the Observation Problem. Shouter Aizawa was not affected by the quirk. This was the first and most important piece of information Izumi gathered in the first week of Class 1A. She had been prepared for many scenarios. She had not been prepared for this one, a teacher whose quirk was erasure, who could cancel quirks, and who had apparently decided to point it at her during the assessment. She had felt it the moment the goggles tracked her. The suppression she maintained became suddenly irrelevant because from Aizawa's perspective, she simply had no quirk. It was like trying to keep a window closed while someone removed the window. She had stood in the field and done the 10-meter ball throw without any quirk support, because the only option was to throw the ball and not throw the ball, and she had opted for throwing the ball. He had looked at the number. He had looked at her. She had looked back at him. He had made a note. Nothing about his expression suggested the warmth of quirk influence. His face was the same face it had been before, skeptical, assessing, the particular neutral quality of someone who had trained themselves out of having visible reactions to things, not affected, just watching. She had felt something that took her a moment to identify, relief. The specific relief of a person who has spent weeks in a world where every interaction had a variable she could not control, finally encountering someone who removed the variable entirely. In Notebook 23 that evening she wrote, AIZAWASHOUTA, erasure quirk confirmed. When active, pull BCOMES non-functional. When inactive, proximity rules still apply but he shows no signs of quirk influence. Hypothesis, either A, he maintains erasure active continuously around me specifically, or B, he has some natural psychological resistance to the quirk's effect. She thought about that second option. She thought about what it meant if some people were naturally resistant. She thought about what it meant about every person who was not. She added, this is the only person in the school WHOSE reaction to me I can currently trust to be genuine. This is both useful and depressing. She underlined depressing. She put down the pen. She thought about Class 1A. She had spent the first week watching them with her analysis notebooks. 20 people, 20 quirks, 20 personalities, the specific complex social ecosystem of a group of people who had all been told they were exceptional and were now trying to figure out which of them was more exceptional. She had documented all of them. What she had not documented, what she was working very hard not to document, because documenting it would make it real, and making it real would require her to make a decision about it, was the way certain people in the class looked at her. Uraraka, who had been sitting next to her since the first day, and who had an unnerving tendency to initiate conversation at moments when Izumi's suppression was strained from other things. Todoroki, who had twice now looked at her across the classroom with the specific quality of someone who was trying to understand something they did not currently have the vocabulary for. Kirishima, who had been nothing but warm to everyone, but who was warm to her with a slight edge of additional focus that she had noticed and not mentioned. Even Ida, whose personality was so relentlessly formal that it was hard to read anything in it, but who had assisted her twice now in situations where she had not asked for assistance. She had labeled all of these in Notebook 23. She had put asterisks next to all of them. The asterisks meant do not assume, gather more data. She had also drawn a small bracket around all of them and written, isolate and test, can authentic relationship exist with someone who has been exposed to pull? She did not have an answer yet. She was working on it. Chapter 6, the day the League found out. She had known they would find out eventually. Hero Society was, among other things, a surveillance apparatus. The quirk registry, the assessment reports, the entrance exam footage, the continuous monitoring of potential threats. She had known from the moment she manifested pull that someone somewhere was going to look at the counselor's report from the day of her manifestation and ask the right questions. She had not expected it to be the League of Villains. She had not expected them to send Toga. Himiko Toga showed up at the UA gates on a Tuesday in October, not in disguise, or rather in a disguise so light it was almost performative. School uniform a half size too small, hair up differently, everything wrong about her if you were looking carefully enough, and she was looking carefully enough. Toga looked at her. She looked back. The quirk pulsed. Toga's reaction to it was not the warmth she saw in Uraraka or the attentive shift she had seen in Kirishima, or even the specific quality she had seen in Kaken that had alarmed her with its completeness. Toga's reaction was different. Her eyes lit up. Not the lit-up quality of someone falling under the quirk's influence, the lit-up quality of someone who recognized something. She said, in the quick, bright voice of someone who had just found something they were looking for, "You're the one Shigaraki has been talking about, the girl with the devotion quirk." Izumi stopped walking. She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Toga tilted her head. She said, "You're trying to suppress it right now, aren't you? I can tell. It's like there's almost something there, and then it isn't. Like you're breathing, but you're holding your breath at the same time." Izumi said nothing. Toga said, "You know what Shigaraki said when he heard about your quirk. He said if she joins us, we win. Just her. No one else needed. A girl who makes everyone devoted to her, walking into the Hero Commission, into UA, into every system that Hero Society has." "No," Izumi said. She said it simply, not with heat, just as a fact. Toga looked at her. Izumi said, "My quirk isn't a weapon. It isn't a strategy. It isn't mine to use on people without their knowledge. I didn't choose to have it. I don't use it deliberately." A pause. Toga was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a different voice, quieter, without the performance, "That's the most alone thing I've ever heard someone say about their own quirk." Izumi looked at her. She thought about Rule 5, do not count it. It belongs to the quirk, not to you. She thought about every relationship she had filed under asterisks in Notebook 23. She thought about the counselor's face on the day of her manifestation, the complete, immediate, unearned devotion. She thought about Uraraka saying, "I want to know everything in the aftermath of the entrance exam," and whether that had been the quirk or the person, or whether that distinction was even something she was going to be able to maintain forever. She said, "Yes, it is." Toga looked at her for a long moment. She said, "If you change your mind, the League is full of people who were told their quirks made them wrong. We figured out that the wrong part wasn't the quirk." She turned and walked away. Izumi watched her go. In Notebook 23 that night, she wrote about the encounter in full detail. Every word, every observation, every analysis she could extract from it. Then she sat with the notebook closed in her lap and thought for a very long time about what Toga had said. That's the most alone thing I've ever heard someone say about their own quirk. She thought about the word alone. She thought about being inside a school full of people who might be falling for her by accident. She thought about Aizawa, who was not affected, and who had started looking at her differently in the past week, not with warmth, not with devotion, but with the specific focused attention of someone who had noticed something and was waiting for the right moment to ask about it. She thought he already knows. She thought not everything, but enough to be asking. She opened Notebook 23. She wrote, decision point. Aizawa is going to ask. I need to decide before he does whether I tell HIM the truth. She thought about Rule 4, do not tell anyone. She thought about Rule 4 addendum, especially the people you actually want to like you. She added, because she was always honest with herself, but Aizawa is not affected. He cannot like me because of the quirk. Whatever he feels about me will always be genuine. She stopped. She read that back. She realized what she had just written, and what it meant about how she had been thinking about Aizawa, without fully acknowledging it until now. She added, this is a very complicated situation. She closed the notebook. Chapter 7, Aizawa ASKS. He waited until after class. He did this very deliberately. She knew he did it deliberately because she had been watching him all week, and she recognized the deliberateness when she saw it, the way he had created a series of situations in which they were naturally alone, each of which he had then walked away from without saying anything. Each walk away had felt like a test, a wait to see if she would bring it up herself. She had not. So he asked directly. He said, your quirk registration lists your ability as aura, ambient emotional influence, emitter type, low range. She said, that's correct. He said, it's not correct. She looked at him. He said, I've been watching you for 6 weeks. I've watched you manage proximity to your classmates with a consistency that looks like anxiety, but isn't. I've watched you increase distance from people when they show specific behavioral markers. I've watched you perform at a significantly reduced capacity in combat training relative to your actual physical conditioning, which is excellent, in ways that would be consistent with a person deliberately refusing to use their quirk offensively. She said nothing. He said, and I've watched your classmates. A pause. She said, what did you observe? He said, a pattern, consistent across multiple individuals. Behavioral and attitudinal shifts in proximity to you that are subtle enough to be plausibly attributed to normal social bonding, but are consistent in their direction and proportion in ways that normal social bonding doesn't produce in 6 weeks. She said, and. He said, and I want you to tell me what your quirk actually does. She looked at him. She had spent 6 weeks thinking about this conversation. She had prepared multiple versions of it in Notebook 25. In version 1, she lied. She told him the registration description was accurate and used the fact that he could erase it to argue that if it were as powerful as he seemed to think, he would have noticed stronger effects. In version 2, she gave him partial information, enough to explain the proximity management without explaining the full scope. In version 3, she told him everything. She had written extensive arguments for versions 1 and 2. She had not written any arguments for version 3. Because version 3 did not require arguments. Version 3 was just, he is the only person in this building whose reaction to me is not contaminated. I can tell him the truth and it will land somewhere real. I will know what he actually thinks. She said, I call it pull. She told him everything. All of it, the counselor, the rules, the notes, the asterisks in Notebook 23, the entrance exam, Toga at the gate, all of it clearly and without softening in the specific direct language of someone who had been documenting their own situation for 6 weeks and had a very complete set of notes to draw from. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, you've been actively suppressing it for 6 weeks. Trying to. You never deliberately used it. No, even in the entrance exam. No, the pulse at the entrance exam was involuntary. I've noted it as a failure of suppression under physical and emotional stress. He looked at her for a long time. He said, you registered it as low-level ambient emotional influence, deliberately. Yes, I didn't want it classified as a psychological quirk, those get more scrutiny and oversight. Because you didn't want it documented fully. Because I didn't want anyone to use the documentation as a reason to restrict it, or me, or she stopped, because I wanted to handle it myself. He said that was the wrong call. She said, I know. He said, but the reason behind it wasn't wrong. She looked at him. He said, you identified a significant ethical problem with your quirk at the moment of manifestation. You established rules. You maintained them under significant social and physical pressure. You reported a league contact immediately rather than treating it as an opportunity. He paused. Most students with a quirk of this scale would have used it on their first social interaction and assumed the results were genuine. She said, I know. He said, that restraint cost you. She said nothing. He said, 6 weeks of not knowing if anything around you was real. She was quiet for a moment. She said, yes. He looked at her. She looked back. She said, is this real, this conversation? He said, my quirk is active, has been since the start of this conversation. She said, then you know exactly what I mean. He said, yes. A long pause. He said, I'm going to help you understand and control the quirk properly. I'm going to adjust the quirk registration to be more accurate, and I'm going to tell you something that you need to hear. She waited. He said, pull works on attention. It redirects focus. What it doesn't do, what you documented in your own notes but haven't processed yet, is create personality. The warmth that Uraraka showed you before the pulse at the entrance exam. The way Kirishima includes you in group activities. None of those are manufactured by a quirk. The quirk doesn't create character. It amplifies direction. She said, I don't understand the distinction. He said, pull doesn't make someone care about you. It makes someone who already had the capacity to care about you start doing it now instead of later. She looked at him. She said, how do you know? He said, because I've been watching your classmates for 6 weeks. And what I've seen in them isn't the specific pattern of people who have been externally compelled. It's the specific pattern of people who are genuinely connecting with someone and are doing it slightly faster than they normally would. She said, that doesn't mean. He said, it doesn't mean everything is real. You're right to maintain uncertainty, but it means the data you're filing under not real isn't exclusively wrong. She looked at her notebook. She looked at the asterisks. She thought about Uraraka. She thought about the entrance exam and the 0-pointer, and together. She did not change the asterisks, but she changed the note below them. It had said, do not assume. Now she wrote, maintain uncertainty, but do not assume nothing is real either. She put down the pen. Aizawa was still sitting across from her, his quirk active, his face the same face it was always, flat, skeptical, the specific neutral quality of someone who had trained themselves out of visible reactions. She said, why did you wait 6 weeks to ask? He said, I was seeing if you would break the rules before I did. Did I? No. She said, what does that tell you? He said, it tells me what I already suspected. She waited. He said that you are going to be a significant hero someday, and that the reason you are going to be significant has nothing to do with pull. She looked at him. She thought about the rules. She thought about 6 weeks of loneliness and asterisks, and do not count it. She thought about the word real. She wrote in notebook 23, in the margin beside everything she had written about Aizawa Shouter. Confirmed genuine, erasure active, not contaminated. She underlined it. She closed the notebook. She said, what do we do now? He said, we figure out how to make you a hero, starting with not having to choose between using your quirk and maintaining your ethics. She said, you think those can both happen at once? He said, I think that's the job. And that is where we leave Izuku Midoriya today, not resolved, not fixed, still carrying 23 notebooks full of asterisks and uncertainties and rules she built for herself because no one else was going to, still not knowing for certain which of the things around her are real and which are pull, but knowing for the first time that the answer might be more complicated and more hopeful than the categories she built to keep herself safe. That is not nothing. In fact, that might be everything. That is all for today. If you want part 2, if you want to see what happens when Izumi finally tests whether Uraraka is real, when the League makes their actual move, when she uses pull for the first time deliberately and has to live with what it costs her, then drop exactly one word in the comments. Not a sentence. One word, the word that describes what you think pull actually is. Is it a curse, a gift, a weapon, a door? One word. I read all of them. Like the video, subscribe, notifications on,